I'm Sarah Hagan from Central Iowa Power Cooperative in Des Moines, Iowa. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
Support for this podcast comes from LDR Leadership. LDR Leadership inspires people and electric cooperatives to be their best by providing evidence-based leadership and performance management training. They believe in coaching to win.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm your host, Scott Hoffman. The concepts of emotional intelligence and soft skills in the workplace have been around a long time, at least since the mid-90s when Daniel Goleman's bestseller, Emotional Intelligence, came out. Now, as electric cooperatives look back over the past 18 months to assess how they managed the challenges of the pandemic and what lessons they may have learned, the broad value and effectiveness of soft skills is beginning to emerge. Multiple studies have found that the companies that fared best during this difficult time were those whose leaders were able to show concern for stressed-out employees, who quickly adapted to online work, and who actively invited new ideas and creativity from their teams. Today, we're going to discuss why that is and how it's informing many co-ops' business practices going forward. We'll talk to Tracy Steiner. She's the Senior Vice President of Education and Training at NRECA, and Charlie Dunn, the CEO of Farmers Electric Cooperative in Greenfield, Iowa. Charlie's been a long-time proponent of building emotional intelligence among his staff. Tracy, Charlie, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
All right, Tracy, why don't you start us off with sort of a basic definition? What do we mean when we say soft skills, and what do we mean when we say emotional intelligence?
Sure, and I think sometimes people mix up those definitions a little bit, but when I think of soft skills, I really mean those interpersonal skills that impact a person's ability to interact, communicate, and collaborate effectively with other people. And emotional intelligence is a more defined term, and it really has two aspects to it. First is the ability to recognize and understand and manage our own emotions and understanding how our emotions impact others. And then recognizing, understanding, and hopefully being able to positively influence other people's emotions. So intelligence in two ways, of ourselves and then of others, because we recognize that our emotions do impact our ability to resolve conflict. They impact our ability to make good decisions, to communicate well. So our cognitive ability is really impacted by our interpersonal skills. So they really go hand in hand with one another.
Great. That's perfect. And Charlie, I know you put a strong emphasis on developing soft skills among your co-op's leaderships as well as the staff. What was it that put this issue or this skill on your radar, and when and sort of how did you decide to elevate this as a skill set at Farmers?
Yeah, Scott, we certainly need all the, if you want to call them hard skills, technical skills, an electric utility, electric co-op, the engineering, accounting, HR, IT, line construction. We have to have all those. But as Tracy very aptly defined emotional intelligence and the soft skills, we have to have those to make all those positions more effective. We're here to try to do the best job for our members, and we want a positive culture here at the co-op, and the way to do that is to hire employees that have these soft skills that we're discussing, and then to further develop those skills. So I guess I came to really, in coming up through the co-op and in my career, maybe at first I really didn't know the academic or technical terms around these skills. But as I started moving into leadership positions and studying more about leadership, and through my academic work, I really came to appreciate how much research has been done on this and how effective it actually is to hone in on these skills and develop them further, especially in leadership positions. So it became very important to me to be able to identify these skills in employees, and then to not only identify it, but to develop it further through training, reading, development, academic work, all the great things that the co-op world has to offer for us.
Awesome. And Tracy, we know that the pandemic sort of exposed the value and brought to the fore the value of some of these skills. Talk about, from a national perspective, what has it taught us about the need to encourage not only the development of soft skills, but the emotional intelligence that sort of permeates the whole organization?
Yeah, I think that what the pandemic did was pretty much put a big spotlight on some things we already knew and maybe bumped them up to the top of the list in terms of importance. And I think about the early days of the pandemic when a lot of states went into quarantine and people had to go and work from home. And that put a whole new dynamic on the workplace. And it put a new dynamic in how co-ops were going to go about getting their work done. And it forced us to really think about things differently, to interact with one another differently. And the way that people were successful around that was really focusing on communication and collaboration in their own right. So not just the content of the information that was being shared with employees, for example, but really how they were going about it, what channels they were using. And from the perspective of being, in the business of trying to offer co-ops professional development opportunities, we saw a real emphasis and need based on the feedback that we were getting from participants in some of our other courses to say, I need help making sure that I don't lose the culture that I built up at my co-op. I need help making sure that my team is really collaborating effectively. We're not used to interacting over a screen. We're used to being in the office. We used to have water cooler conversations, and how do I get that back? So really kind of first adapting by using new tools to do that. But then as time wore on and some of these restrictions, continued and people had to adjust and recognize the stress that people were working under. Think of young families in particular having to deal with childcare concerns or those with aging parents. All of that stress that they were dealing with in their personal lives was bleeding over into their work life. And so emotionally intelligent leaders who recognized that and showed empathy and tried to support their folks really had a lot better time. And many leaders that I talk about in co-ops are saying they feel like they're emerging stronger as a result of this experience, that they really have gotten to know their teams at a level that they didn't before. So I think that then puts the impetus on us to make sure that we're providing support for developing those skills and keeping them up as we go forward.
Yeah. Charlie, I wanted to kind of get your perspective on the ground at your co-op. Did some of these things that you had already put in place pay off as this pandemic unfolded and as you sort of adapted to the new normal?
Yes, it really did, Scott. We had done quite a bit of cross-training with employees so that they could step into other roles. And we had started, really when I came to the co-op here, one of my focuses was going to be on leadership development. That's something I'm really passionate about. And I wanted a leadership team that, could step in if something happened to me or could, run with any challenge that I gave them. So, I think having those skills prior, especially as Tracy discussed, the challenges that COVID brought, having those communication skills and employees that have these soft skills of self-awareness, understanding how their behavior and communication styles impact the rest of the team and the rest of the employees paid huge dividends through COVID. And I think it will in any scenario that you throw up. The better that you can communicate, the more positive feedback you have, the more of a positive work environment that you have, whatever crisis it is, whether it's a huge ice storm, wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever, is thrown our way. Having that style of communication and leadership is always going to result in a better outcome.
Awesome. And Tracy, you mentioned before that sort of the impetus is on you to change some of the training and content that you develop. Have you had an uptick in requests from members saying, okay, we realize that we're falling a little bit short on this and we need some help getting up to speed on these skills?
Definitely seeing that. And it really, again, was something that we were starting to see as an emerging trend and interest. And I really credit that to, newer leaders in the program coming up and folks like Charlie who saw that. And it's a different management style than a more traditional top-down management. Newer leaders coming up want a more collaborative and innovative culture. And being able to communicate well, resolve conflicts, have empathy and understanding of different perspectives, those are all critical soft skills that help support that kind of a culture. So we had actually begun work on a new curriculum called the Cooperative Career Essentials Program, which really focused on some corollary skills to what we were teaching in our supervisory and management classes. And it comes down to a lot to, again, communication, teamwork, collaboration, accountability, problem solving, very, again, much in that interpersonal skills bucket. And we're seeing a good uptake of those new courses as they roll out. Now, originally, of course, we had thought about delivering them all in person, and we had to make some adjustments and reformat them for an online delivery model during the pandemic. But it's been great to see folks really getting a lot out of that. And some of the feedback we're getting is just really very touching, because these are skills, obviously, that cross over into your personal life. And for some of these folks, it's been really life-changing. And that's obviously very rewarding, and the kind of impact that we like to have on people when we bring them into a learning environment. So yes, the answer is definitely seeing an uptick. And I think that that's going to continue.
Okay, let's pause here quickly for a word from our sponsor. Then we'll come back and talk to Charlie about how these soft skills fit in with a changing workforce.
Support for Along Those Lines comes from LDR Leadership, who believe people are the most important resource. A veteran-owned company, LDR Leadership believes in hands-on training that helps leaders gain effective methods for creating a positive cultural change within electric cooperatives in a proactive and beneficial manner. That is why electric cooperatives have trusted their evidence-based proactive performance coaching program for over 20 years. To learn more, visit www.ldrleadership.com.
I'm Jacqueline from Tri-State Generation and Transmission in Westminster, Colorado. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
Welcome back. So Charlie, one of the challenges that co-ops are dealing with now is onboarding a younger workforce as waves of older employees are beginning to retire. These younger workers have different ideas about workplace culture, about hierarchy, about work-life balance, things like that. Talk about how soft skills and emotional intelligence play into that particular equation and how it helps co-ops attract and keep these younger employees.
Yeah, that's very true, Scott. And I was going to say it's always been my philosophy to always hire the best person for the position and not worry about they're going to be there long term, stay forever, or whatever. But I guess that wouldn't be true. That's not always been my philosophy. I've come to learn that throughout my career, that it is so important that you focus on hiring the best person for the job. And that once you hire that person, if you have the right culture and the right environment, and you give that person the right training, that you stand a very good chance that person will stay. And if not, if another opportunity comes up for that employee and they move on to bigger, better things, then so be it. That's just part of doing business, and we'll wish them all the best and hire the next person we think is the best person for the job. But I really feel like once we hire an employee, if I can give them the tools to be successful, and that's my job. That as a manager, as a CEO here at the co-op, my role is to ensure that the leadership team and the executive staff have all the resources they need to be successful. I really see that as my role, not being the subject matter expert on everything that they do, but just ensuring that they have that. And as the discussion unfolds here, as we're talking about the soft skills, that communication, that self-awareness, that knowing how your behavior impacts the rest of the team. If you're having a bad day and you're in a leadership position and you allow that to roll downhill and affect everyone else, then you're hurting the co-op and all the rest of the employees. So try to be on guard against that. Doesn't mean that I'm unemotional. If I'm disappointed with staff or someone, then I can show that. Or if I'm extremely pleased, I can show that too. But it's just understanding the impact it will have and moving forward.
Right. Charlie, do you find, if you've done any new hiring lately, do you find that younger employees do respond better to that? Or is it really just kind of finding how it works for each employee across the board?
Different employees certainly do respond differently, but I am finding that the younger employees that we're hiring, they like a much more open, transparent communication style. I can remember as a young employee at a co-op that rarely ever spoke to the general manager. When you did, it was just very, very quick and to the point, and you went on. And I really feel like, today it's different. Some of the youngest employees here, are just happy to, if we have a minute, sit down and talk about what they did over the weekend and get to know their family and things like that. So I think having that personal relationship, with the rest of the employees and with your staff makes a world of difference.
Great. Tracy, I imagine that our listeners might be interested in hearing a sort of an on-the-ground example of how soft skills would work in a particular scenario that would create a better outcome by using soft skills and by using emotional intelligence. Do you have something you can kind of relate with that would tee that up and make it more real?
Yeah, I think this is a common one that co-ops are encountering, is that we're going through a lot of changes to the kind of technology we're using or our workflow and work processes. And again, COVID brought a lot of that to a head where we had to learn how to do things remotely or shift different transactions online. And during any change environment, there's already this big emotional arc that people go through. There's sort of the resistance and fear, and then there's sort of this trough of, well, I'm sort of getting my sea legs. I'm kind of getting warmed up to the idea to hopefully coming out on the other end feeling very confident and good about the change. So a leader or a project leader, not necessarily a direct supervisor, but someone who's managing that change effort, who recognizes that people are going to go through that emotional roller coaster and provides the right kind of support, training, and communication throughout the process. They're building the case for why. They're making it meaningful personally, like what is that change going to do to this individual or this individual work unit, explaining that to them, explaining what the benefits are. It gets back to what Charlie said about, younger employees in particular, they want more transparency. I grew up in a household where sometimes I heard, you do it because I said so, not getting any rationale behind it. And I came to learn as a parent there was a rationale, but sometimes parents didn't take the time to explain. Same thing in the workplace, not assuming that people understand or know everything that you do as the leader of that initiative. So taking the time, explaining it in terms that are meaningful for that individual employee. That's one of those, again, real on the ground kinds of things that's going to happen again and again. And it may feel to that leader who's got to do that like that is so much more time and effort, but I tell you, it'll make the change go a lot faster and a lot smoother if employees are fully invested, they have a clear line of sight for what you're trying to accomplish and what their role is, and also what they're going to get out of it. So that's probably one of the best examples I can come up with that I think just about everybody's going to experience at one point or another.
That's perfect. What about you, Charlie? You want to weigh in there? I'm sure you see stuff on the ground all the time where you are.
Tracy, she hit the nail on the head there. I've come to realize this in the last 6 or 7 years that the younger employees that we've hired really wanted to understand how they fit within the organization. I can remember as a young co-op employee, whatever job I had, I wanted to do it to the best of my ability. But I wasn't really maybe concerned with what another department was doing. It really was just kind of out of my purview and didn't really think about it a lot. But our younger employees now, they really want to know the big picture. They want to know what the overall goal is, how we're making our system more reliable, what long-term goals are for, replacing outdated wire and things like that. So, and I appreciate that. I think that's a good outlook, and it gives them more meaning to their job, understanding that, they're not just, out there changing out a bad pole, but they're helping our members in the future have more reliable service. And I think it means more to all of us.
One of the things that's sort of the elephant in the room with this discussion is the idea that these skills are either gender-based or they're inherent and not necessarily teachable. It's one of those either you got it or you don't things. I know you both have different views on that. Charlie, you said already that you've been proactive on sending employees for training to kind of train up on these skills. Talk a little bit about that effort and what you've seen in the way of your staff, how they've adapted and how they've learned.
Yeah, I certainly think comes down on, there's certainly two different arguments about whether this is a nature versus nurture type skill set. But I certainly think it's on a spectrum, and I certainly think it is a skill that can be enhanced. Tracy's staff there at NRECA, they have a great training program. My leadership team, one of my goals is to get them all through MIP, Management Internship Program, because I just think that's such a phenomenal leadership training school. It teaches you a lot of the hard technical stuff, skills you need, the accounting, the finance, the operations and things like that. But it also goes deep dive into the emotional skills, the self-awareness, learning how you as a leader impact the rest of your team, the rest of the employees, the whole co-op. And I just highly recommend that. And then, our statewide organization too, through help within our ECA, they offer some great training as well, not just for the employees, but the directors. And that's one area that is so important, that our directors, have this same mindset of continuing to train and develop these skills, because, the directors at the end of the day, they hold the purse strings, and we rely on them to, approve our budgets. And in those budgets, we put in a lot of training and development for employees. And I'm very, very fortunate here at the REC I work at, that I've got a board, totally dedicated to the training and development of our employees. So, kudos to Tracy and her staff, and a shout out to Katrina there at her Iowa Association.
And so just to sort of nail you down on it, this is trainable. This is a learnable skill. You did mention that it's a spectrum, and there are certain things that are going to be easier for some.
Right.
But yeah, I just want to kind of get that out there.
Yeah, I think the research bears that out. That it's there are certainly people who are naturally genetically are born with a higher level of it than other people. But that doesn't pigeonhole you into, okay, you have low, maybe you scored low on an emotional intelligence test, that you're stuck there forever. You can certainly increase that. It's my opinion that you can, and I think research bears that out, that you can increase these soft skills, your communication styles. You can better understand how your actions impact other people, and adjust that communication style to the member, the other employee, the fellow staff member that you're dealing with, to have a more successful communication.
Yeah. And Tracy, from your perspective, talk about what you see at the national level, where you see lots of different personalities coming through these programs and lots of people approaching you about what they need for their co-op. What do you see on your side?
Yeah, well, I'm obviously probably a little biased that I do believe that these are trainable skills, but I want to go back to something that Charlie said earlier about hiring for people. If you recognize this set of soft skills and emotional intelligence as really being important and something you want to promote at your culture, then by all means, start by getting the best people in the door. And that's going to mean you're going to ask them different questions than you would just to identify whether or not they have those hard technical skills in their domain of expertise, whether that's engineering or operations or HR or member services or whatever. But then I think, once you've got good people on board, then that self-awareness is something that needs to be developed over time. Some people, I think, have, as Charlie said, more of an innate ability to understand and regulate their own emotions. But one thing we typically see in a lot of the training is they really vastly underestimate the impact that how they handle themselves impacts others around them on their team. And that is usually the big aha moment we see in a lot of our classes, is that they had no idea that there is so much differentiation of how people perceive one thing that a leader says, and that they are really focusing in on not just the words that they're used, but their body language, their tone, their volume of their voice, even the medium. Like, did this happen in an all-staff meeting, or did the CEO come around and tell individual groups? They're really paying attention to those things. And it makes a difference. So I think from my perspective, those are some of the more valuable things that we can do. And in the training, we try to take a continuous improvement attitude. Like, wherever you are, there's always room to get a little bit better. And there's always room to build a little bit more expertise. And particularly if you are a leader of other people, I think it's important not just to develop those skills in you, but you want to help your team come along. And so formal training is great. It can give people the language and the vocabulary to understand these concepts, but then it's really got to be reinforced once they get back home. And that's where the culture piece comes in, and other types of learning that Charlie talked about, encouraging people to do reading and taking these up at, staff meetings and other opportunities that come up on a less formal basis to reinforce what folks have learned in a training program is where the rubber really meets the road.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to the last question I want to ask. And it's getting back to the pandemic. As bad as the pandemic has been, there's been some silver linings. The focus on rural broadband, telemedicine, work from home, things like that. I would include the spotlight that the pandemic has put on the value of soft skills in workplace as one of those silver linings. Can you both talk about how this situation presents opportunities to help co-ops sort of move forward, not only culturally, but in all facets of the business?
Sure, yeah. I think going through the pandemic, it shined a spotlight on some holes that a lot of us had at our co-op, things we needed to work on, things we needed to do better. And it also allowed us to, learn a completely new communication style with all the Zoom teams, all the go-to-meetings that we had virtually. And the soft skills, in a room, I guess you can kind of read body language differently and things like that. But, I guess I've picked up on a lot in Zoom meetings. One example, that if I'm having a Zoom meeting with someone and they're continually looking off camera and you can tell they're doing email or they're, texting on their phone, you don't have their attention. and they're not really paying attention. And that's a behavior that, shown me, well, if I do that, maybe they're feeling the same thing I'm feeling, that I'm not really interested in what they have to say or what they're doing. So, I've tried to guard myself against that. But, I think here at Farmers REC, I think the pandemic has actually brought us closer as a team and maybe as employees. We really had to put a lot of protocols in place that, we'd never dealt with before. And everybody, because we have a positive culture here, and, everyone wanted to look out for everyone else. Everyone came together and, did what we needed to do to keep everyone safe and keep the power flowing to our members.
I think, Scott, this very much aligns with what Charlie's experience has been, is that this pandemic was something that hit all of us. And while we responded to it or reacted to it or were impacted differently, it was a common shared experience. And one of the ways that you really bring a team together and drive a culture forward is creating that sense of shared experience and shared purpose. And the only other thing I can equate it to are situations where you have a major storm event or an outage event, and then it's all hands on deck. Everybody shows up and brings their best self. That's when I see co-ops really shine. This was like that, but just such a long, extended event with so much uncertainty and so much beyond our control. Whereas, while we can't control Mother Nature, we know at some point that bad weather event is going to end, and we'll be able to, kick in all of our plans for response and repair, and that emergency situation will eventually lift. And this was obviously much more prolonged. But again, that sense of shared experience and the empathy that leaders showed, I really think that has done a tremendous amount for co-ops that wanted to have that cultural reset, either in a dramatic fashion or they just wanted to tweak it a little bit. And I think that, again, with an emphasis on soft skills going forward, is not just a one and done, but something we continually try to get better at, that's really what's going to propel co-ops forward and help them make lasting positive changes that they want to see. Because that is something that I've heard from some co-op CEOs, is they don't want to lose some of this newfound sense of teamwork and collaboration and innovation that they're seeing at their co-ops.
It's such an interesting dynamic that's at play right now, and there really is a lot to keep an eye on going forward. So I just want to thank you, Tracy and Charlie, for coming on and sharing your insights. That was a really, really good discussion.
It's been my pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Me too.
And thanks to our sponsor, LDR Leadership, and to you, our listeners. For more on this and other podcasts, visit electric.coop. Until next time, for Along Those Lines, I'm Scott Hoffman.
Hi, I'm Nikki White from Cumming County Public Power District in West Point, Nebraska. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.